Before dawn, the battlefield was still wrapped in fog. German officers believed armor would wait for daylight, it always had. But somewhere beyond the mist, American tank engines were already turning. Columns moved without headlights, guided by radios, timing, and doctrine refined far from the front. This was not a gamble. It was preparation made visible. And when the fog began to lift, the battlefield was already lost. Stay with this story, and see how American tempo rewrote the rules of armored war. By the time the Second World War entered its third year, European armies carried deep assumptions about how armored warfare worked, and, more importantly, when it could work. Tanks were powerful, but they were also considered blind machines. Steel required sight. Command required visibility. Control required daylight. From Poland to France, and later across the Eastern Front, armored movement had been built around a predictable rhythm: advance after first light, consolidate before dusk, halt in darkness. German doctrine reinforced this belief. The early successes of Blitzkrieg in 1939 and 1940 had been fast, violent, and decisive, but they were not reckless. They depended on coordination between armor, infantry, artillery, and air support, all tied together by line-of-sight command. Even as German units proved capable of night marches, decisive armored engagements were expected to wait for visibility. Fog, darkness, and low cloud were considered conditions to endure, not exploit. This mindset hardened as the war progressed. On the Eastern Front, where terrain and weather were far harsher, German armored units learned painful lessons about disorientation, mechanical strain, and command breakdown in poor visibility. Tanks that outran their infantry at night risked isolation. Units that advanced without clear visual reference risked friendly fire or fragmentation. Over time, caution became institutional. Pre-dawn hours were reserved for preparation, not commitment. Across Western Europe and North Africa, these assumptions were shared more broadly. Armored forces required maps, landmarks, visual signals, and coordinated fire. Without them, doctrine warned, tempo collapsed. Even experienced formations hesitated to move heavy armor before sunrise unless the route was secured and uncontested. Dawn marked the opening of combat. Before it, forces staged and waited. When the United States entered the war, its early encounters appeared to confirm these beliefs rather than challenge them. American forces arriving in 1942 lacked combat experience. Their armored units were still adapting doctrine written in peacetime, trained across vast ranges rather than contested front lines. Early engagements in North Africa exposed weaknesses in coordination and command under pressure. For German observers, this reinforced a familiar conclusion: American forces possessed material strength, but not yet tactical maturity. What German planners did not immediately see was where the American system was changing. Unlike European armies shaped by limited geography and long tradition, the U.S. Army was being rebuilt almost from the ground up, at industrial scale. Training cycles were standardized. Command structures were simplified. Radios were issued widely, not sparingly. Logistics were designed around redundancy rather than efficiency alone. Time, fuel, spare parts, and replacement crews were planned not just to sustain operations, but to maintain tempo regardless of conditions. This difference mattered. Where older doctrines viewed darkness and fog as constraints, American planners increasingly treated them as variables, manageable through preparation. Movement tables were rehearsed repeatedly. Units trained to navigate without visual cues. Maintenance schedules emphasized reliability over peak performance. Crews learned to trust procedures when sight failed. By late 1943 and into 1944, this approach was beginning to show results. American formations no longer measured readiness solely by daylight conditions. Instead, they measured it by coordination, whether infantry, armor, artillery, and command could move together on time, regardless of visibility. Fog did not cancel an operation. Darkness did not delay commitment. If the plan was ready, execution followed. German intelligence struggled to adjust to this shift. Reports still framed American forces through older assumptions: technically competent, well-supplied, but operationally conservative. Pre-dawn hours were considered safe margins, moments before contact, not moments of contact themselves. That belief would not survive the next phase of the war. As American units began to treat time itself as a weapon, the boundary between night and day lost its meaning. And once that boundary disappeared, German defensive planning, built around predictable rhythms, began to fracture in ways no amount of tactical skill could fully repair. The fog that once promised delay was about to become a doorway. What separated American armored formations from their European counterparts was not courage or improvisation. It was system design. By 1943, the United States Army had accepted a blunt reality: wars at industrial scale were not won by brilliance alone, but by repeatable processes that functioned under stress. Visibility, weather, and fatigue were no longer treated as exceptions. They were treated as constants. Training reflected that shift. American armored units rehearsed movement by timetable rather than by sight. Crews learned routes in sequence, memorized distances, and practiced halts and turns without visual confirmation. Radio procedure became second nature. Commands were short, standardized, and drilled until response required no interpretation. When engines started, every crew knew not just where to go, but when to be there. This emphasis on time discipline changed everything. In older doctrines, night and fog slowed operations because coordination depended on visual control. In the American system, coordination depended on synchronization. Units moved because the clock said they moved. Artillery lifted because the clock said it lifted. Infantry advanced because armor was scheduled to be in position, not because it was visible. Behind this approach stood logistics on a scale the war had not seen before. Fuel was stockpiled forward. Spare parts traveled with units rather than waiting in depots. Recovery vehicles were planned into movements, not improvised afterward. If a tank broke down in darkness, procedures existed to clear it without halting the column. Momentum was protected as carefully as lives. Crucially, American planners accepted mechanical limits and planned around them. Engines were tuned for reliability, not peak output. Maintenance schedules were conservative. Crews were rotated before exhaustion set in, not after. This meant armored units could operate during hours traditionally considered marginal, because they were not already operating at the edge of failure. By contrast, German armored doctrine had grown increasingly constrained by attrition. Fuel shortages, spare part scarcity, and experienced crew losses forced commanders to preserve strength whenever possible. Night and fog became periods of risk to avoid, not opportunities to exploit. Even when German units were tactically superior, they were often operationally brittle. This divergence widened as the war moved into Western Europe. American units arriving in force brought not just tanks, but procedures. Every movement order included timing windows. Every attack plan accounted for limited visibility. Staff officers focused less on ideal conditions and more on consistency. If a formation could move at 0400 in fog, it could do so repeatedly, and repetition created confidence. German intelligence reports struggled to categorize this behavior. Pre-dawn movement was sometimes noted, but often dismissed as reconnaissance or repositioning. The assumption remained that decisive armored commitment would wait until first light, when commanders could observe and react. This assumption was not irrational, it had been validated by decades of European military practice. But it no longer matched the enemy. American commanders were not seeking surprise in the dramatic sense. They were seeking compression, reducing the time German forces had to recognize, decide, and respond. By initiating movement before dawn, they shortened the defender's decision window. By the time visibility improved, the situation had already changed. This approach placed pressure not just on frontline units, but on entire defensive systems. Communications lagged. Fire plans activated too late. Reserves moved after contact rather than before it. German officers found themselves reacting to events that had already unfolded in darkness. The result was not chaos, but imbalance. Battles did not begin with a clear opening moment. They were already underway when observers finally understood what they were seeing. As American armored doctrine matured, fog and darkness ceased to be barriers. They became neutral ground, moments when preparation outweighed perception. And once that balance shifted, the battlefield no longer waited for daylight to declare its direction. That shift set the stage for the human, technical, and command-level realities that followed, realities felt most sharply by the men inside the tanks and those trying to stop them. Inside an American tank before dawn, the world was reduced to sound, timing, and trust. Visibility through periscopes was limited to vague shapes and shifting gray. Engines idled low. Crewmen spoke only when required. Each movement followed a sequence practiced until it became instinct. In these hours, success did not depend on what a crew could see. It depended on what they already knew. The human angle of pre-dawn armored movement was defined by discipline rather than bravado. Tank crews understood the risks of operating in fog, misjudged distance, sudden obstacles, unseen enemy weapons. But they also understood their procedures. Routes had been walked and driven in daylight. Distances were counted in engine revolutions and minutes, not landmarks. If a tank halted, the one behind knew exactly how far back to stop. Fear existed, but it was managed by structure. Fatigue played a role, but it was not allowed to dictate tempo. Crews rotated through rest cycles designed to preserve alertness during critical hours. Commanders did not ask exhausted men to perform complex maneuvers in darkness. Instead, schedules were built so that the most demanding phases occurred when crews were freshest, often before the day's full strain began. This attention to human limits allowed American units to operate when others hesitated. From a technological angle, reliability mattered more than innovation. American tanks were not the most heavily armored or most heavily armed vehicles on the battlefield. What they offered instead was consistency. Engines started when ordered. Transmissions functioned predictably. Radios worked across units. This mattered enormously before dawn, when mechanical failure could halt an entire column. Radio discipline was especially critical. Unlike earlier doctrines that relied heavily on visual signals, American armored units communicated continuously. Commands were brief, standardized, and transmitted without commentary. A single transmission could adjust movement across multiple vehicles. In fog, this replaced line-of-sight control entirely. Crews did not need to see their commander, they needed to hear him. This technical reliability extended beyond the tanks themselves. Recovery vehicles followed behind advancing columns. Engineers moved early to clear obstacles. Artillery units were already registered on likely engagement zones before visibility improved. Every supporting element was synchronized to the same timetable. The tank was not an isolated weapon. It was one component in a system designed to function as a whole. The tactical angle revealed why this mattered. Fog and low light reduced the effectiveness of defensive fire. Anti-tank guns relied on visual acquisition. Infantry weapons were limited in range and accuracy. Even well-prepared defensive positions lost coherence when attackers appeared earlier than expected. By moving before dawn, American units did not seek concealment alone, they sought initiative. Initiative meant choosing when contact occurred. German defenders often detected movement only after it was already close. By the time firing began, American armor had already crossed key terrain or established firing positions. The defender's first action became reaction, and reaction consumed time. In modern warfare, time lost at the opening could not be recovered. Crucially, American tactics did not depend on perfect conditions. Fog could thin unexpectedly. Terrain could disrupt movement. But because operations were planned conservatively, minor disruptions did not collapse the advance. Units adjusted locally without stopping the overall flow. This flexibility was built into the plan, not improvised at the moment. For German units facing these advances, the effect was disorienting. Defensive routines were built around expected timelines. Observation posts were manned more heavily at first light. Reserves were prepared to move after sunrise. When armor appeared earlier, these preparations lagged behind reality. The battlefield felt out of sequence. This imbalance did not require overwhelming force. It required timing. By the time visibility improved, American tanks were already where they intended to be. The question was no longer whether they would advance, but how far they had already gone. And as these human, technical, and tactical elements aligned, pressure shifted upward, from crews and platoons to commanders and staffs struggling to understand a battle that had begun before they believed it could. At the command level, American pre-dawn armored operations reflected a leadership philosophy shaped by scale and repetition. U.S. commanders did not expect flawless execution. They expected predictable execution. Plans were designed to function even when individual elements faltered, because the system itself absorbed friction. This approach contrasted sharply with doctrines that relied on exceptional unit performance under ideal conditions. American leadership emphasized delegation bounded by procedure. Junior officers and non-commissioned officers were trained to act within clearly defined limits without waiting for direct supervision. In low visibility, this mattered. A platoon commander did not need to see the entire battlefield to know his role. He needed to know the schedule, the axis of advance, and the coordination points. Authority was distributed downward, but within a framework that preserved coherence. This leadership model allowed armored units to commit before dawn without losing control. Commanders trusted their formations to move on time, maintain spacing, and respond to contact according to doctrine. When contact occurred earlier than expected, it did not derail the plan. It activated it. From the enemy angle, German officers confronted a growing mismatch between expectation and experience. Reports from the field described American armor appearing sooner than anticipated, sometimes before defensive fire plans were fully activated. Observation posts noted engine noise and movement shapes in fog that did not align with established assumptions about when armored attacks began. Initially, these observations were often interpreted narrowly. Early movement was attributed to reconnaissance, repositioning, or limited probes. The idea that a full armored advance would be committed before dawn conflicted with deeply held beliefs about risk and control. German doctrine emphasized careful synchronization, and without clear visibility, decisive movement seemed irresponsible. As these encounters repeated, doubt emerged. Defensive units found themselves engaged earlier in the morning, with less time to prepare. Artillery coordination lagged. Reserves arrived late. The problem was not that German forces lacked skill or courage. It was that their mental timelines no longer matched the enemy's. The psychological angle revealed the deeper impact. Warfare relies not only on weapons, but on expectation. When battles begin at predictable times, defenders adapt. When those times shift, even strong positions feel unstable. American pre-dawn operations eroded confidence without dramatic confrontation. There was no single moment of shock, only a growing sense that control was slipping earlier each day. German officers were trained to read the battlefield visually. Fog and darkness interfered with this process. When American armor exploited those conditions deliberately, it undermined the defenders' ability to assess scale and intent. Was this a probe, or the main effort? By the time the answer became clear, the decision window had closed. This erosion extended beyond the front line. Staff planning assumed certain rhythms of contact. Logistics movements, relief schedules, and command conferences were structured around daylight cycles. When American forces blurred those cycles, friction accumulated throughout the defensive system. Delays multiplied. Small misalignments compounded into operational disadvantage. American commanders understood this effect, even if they did not always articulate it in abstract terms. They recognized that initiative was not only spatial, but temporal. By acting earlier, they forced the enemy to react longer. Each minute gained before dawn reduced the defenders' options after sunrise. Importantly, this was not reckless aggression. American units did not rush blindly into fog. They moved deliberately, supported by artillery already planned, infantry already advancing, and logistics already flowing. The risk was managed, not ignored. That distinction made all the difference. As leadership philosophy, enemy perception, and psychological pressure converged, the stage was set for a decisive test. The next operation would demonstrate whether this approach could break through not just expectations, but defenses themselves, in the hours when the battlefield was still half asleep. The turning point came not with a sudden charge, but with a decision made hours earlier, one written into orders and schedules long before the engines turned. In the early morning hours of a major Western Front operation, American armored units were assigned a task that defied expectation rather than physics. They were to move before first light, advance through ground still covered in mist, and arrive on their objectives before the defenders' day had fully begun. The timing was deliberate. Staff calculations accounted for terrain, speed, fuel consumption, and communication delays. Artillery fire plans were synchronized to the minute. Infantry units were already moving into position while darkness still masked their approach. Engineers prepared to clear obstacles without waiting for visual confirmation. The operation did not begin at dawn. It passed through dawn. As engines started, sound discipline mattered. Columns moved without headlights, guided by distance tables and radio cues. Crews relied on memory and timing rather than sight. The fog was not dense enough to conceal movement entirely, but it was thick enough to distort perception. Shapes appeared closer than they were. Distances felt uncertain. For the attackers, this uncertainty was expected and planned for. On the defending side, German forward elements detected movement earlier than anticipated, but not with clarity. Reports described engine noise and vague silhouettes. Observation posts struggled to determine scale. Without clear visibility, commanders hesitated to commit reserves. The assumption persisted that a full armored assault would wait until conditions improved. By the time that assumption began to erode, American armor had already crossed key terrain. Tanks reached planned phase lines while visibility was still limited. Infantry followed closely, maintaining contact and protecting flanks. Artillery shifted fire according to schedule, not observation, suppressing likely defensive positions before they could fully engage. When contact became unavoidable, it unfolded unevenly. German anti-tank guns fired late, often without precise targeting. Infantry units reacted under pressure rather than preparation. Fire control suffered as crews attempted to identify targets emerging from mist at close range. The battlefield offered no clear opening moment, only a realization that events were already in motion. American commanders did not accelerate recklessly once contact began. They maintained pace. This restraint mattered. Units did not outrun their support. Communications remained intact. When resistance appeared stronger than anticipated, adjustments were made locally without halting the advance. The plan absorbed friction rather than collapsing under it. As dawn approached, visibility improved unevenly across the battlefield. In some areas, fog thinned quickly. In others, it lingered. This inconsistency further complicated the defenders' response. Units attempting to coordinate across sectors faced mismatched conditions. Some saw clearly. Others did not. The attackers' synchronization now confronted the defenders' fragmentation. German officers arriving at command posts after sunrise faced a distorted picture. Reports arrived late and incomplete. Positions thought secure were already under pressure. Reserves moved into contact rather than maneuver. The opportunity to shape the battle had narrowed to damage control. American armor now operated in conditions traditionally considered ideal, daylight and improved visibility, but from positions already gained. Tanks that emerged from the fog did so on favorable ground, with infantry in support and artillery registered ahead. The advantage was not dramatic, but it was decisive. The psychological shift was immediate. German defenders recognized that the initiative had been lost before the day began. The sense of reacting rather than acting settled in. Even where resistance stiffened, it did so too late to restore balance. Momentum favored the side that had chosen the timing. This moment marked more than a successful advance. It validated an approach. American commanders saw confirmation that disciplined pre-dawn movement did not invite chaos, it reduced it. By compressing the defenders' decision window, they simplified their own problem. Fewer choices confronted the enemy. Fewer adjustments were required by the attacker. Losses occurred on both sides. Tanks were damaged. Crews were killed or wounded. But the operational outcome was clear. Ground was gained not through surprise alone, but through sequencing. The battle did not hinge on a single breakthrough or dramatic collapse. It unfolded as a steady displacement of control from one side to the other. For German officers observing the field after the mist lifted, the realization was sobering. The Americans had not waited for favorable conditions as traditionally defined. They had redefined favorable conditions themselves. Dawn was no longer a starting signal. It was simply another phase already overtaken by events. This turning point forced a reassessment. Defensive planning based on predictable timelines no longer held. The rhythm of the battlefield had shifted, and with it, the balance of initiative. That shift would echo beyond the immediate operation, shaping outcomes in the days and weeks that followed, not just in territory gained, but in confidence, doctrine, and expectation on both sides. When the fighting settled and the fog finally lifted across the battlefield, the outcome was measured less by dramatic wreckage than by position. American units held ground that had been expected to remain contested until later in the day. Key road junctions were secured. Defensive belts were penetrated earlier than planned. What mattered most was not how violently the line had broken, but how early control had shifted. Casualty reports reflected a familiar pattern. Losses occurred on both sides, particularly among forward elements that made first contact. Several American tanks were disabled by anti-tank fire at close range, and infantry units took losses during the initial engagements. But these costs did not disrupt the overall operation. Replacement vehicles and crews were already scheduled forward. Units continued to move according to plan rather than pause to account for damage. For German defenders, losses were more uneven. Anti-tank positions overrun before full readiness suffered heavily. Infantry units caught during repositioning were forced into hasty defenses. Artillery assets fired reactively, often without optimal coordination. While some German formations fought effectively once contact was established, they did so from a position already compromised by time. More damaging than casualties was the loss of initiative. German commanders found themselves responding to developments rather than shaping them. Orders issued after sunrise addressed situations that had already changed. Reserves committed later in the morning arrived into pressure rather than maneuver space. Opportunities to counterattack narrowed quickly. Operational reports noted the same theme repeatedly. American armor had appeared earlier than expected, limiting preparation time. This observation surfaced across multiple sectors, suggesting a pattern rather than an anomaly. The implication was unsettling. Defensive timelines that once felt reliable could no longer be trusted. In the days that followed, this realization influenced behavior. German units adjusted by increasing alertness during pre-dawn hours, but this came at a cost. Extended readiness strained already limited manpower. Crews slept less. Maintenance windows shortened. Fatigue accumulated faster. Attempting to mirror American tempo without American resources proved unsustainable. For American forces, the operation reinforced confidence in doctrine. Commanders did not view the outcome as exceptional. They viewed it as confirmation. Pre-dawn movement, when planned correctly, reduced uncertainty rather than increasing it. The battlefield did not become more chaotic, it became more predictable, because events unfolded according to schedule. This confidence translated into future planning. Operations increasingly treated early morning hours as active phases rather than preparatory pauses. Armor, infantry, and artillery were integrated earlier in the daily cycle. The distinction between night movement and daytime combat blurred further. Time became a flexible variable, shaped by planning rather than tradition. German defensive doctrine, by contrast, struggled to adapt fully. While adjustments were made, structural constraints remained. Fuel shortages limited movement. Communications lagged behind American radio saturation. Command authority remained more centralized, slowing reaction under compressed timelines. Even when German officers anticipated early movement, responding effectively required resources they no longer possessed. The psychological impact endured. Reports and after-action assessments reflected growing concern about American operational rhythm. The sense that the enemy controlled not just space, but time, undermined confidence. Defensive planning became reactive by necessity, focused on mitigating losses rather than restoring initiative. Strategically, the cumulative effect mattered. Each operation that began earlier than expected shortened the defender's margin for recovery. Ground gained early in the day shaped engagements later. Momentum carried forward, not dramatically, but persistently. The war of movement favored the side that dictated tempo, and increasingly, that side was American. By the time later campaigns unfolded, the lesson was clear. American dominance did not rest on a single weapon or tactic. It rested on a system that functioned across hours others considered marginal. Fog, dawn, and darkness no longer marked boundaries. They were simply conditions within a continuous operation. As the battlefield returned to routine and units prepared for the next phase, one truth remained evident to both sides: the war no longer waited for daylight to decide its direction. And with that realization, attention turned to what this shift meant beyond a single operation, for doctrine, for future warfare, and for the men who would fight under these new rhythms. The significance of American tanks moving before dawn was not found in the fog itself, but in what the fog revealed. It exposed the difference between armies shaped by tradition and those shaped by systems. One side waited for ideal conditions. The other prepared to operate regardless of them. This shift marked a quiet evolution in modern warfare. Control of the battlefield no longer depended solely on terrain or firepower. It depended on time, who used it, who wasted it, and who assumed it belonged to everyone equally. By compressing the defender's decision window, American forces reduced uncertainty on their own side while multiplying it on the enemy's. What made this approach effective was not recklessness, but restraint. American commanders did not demand heroics from individual crews. They demanded consistency. Procedures replaced improvisation. Coordination replaced spectacle. The result was a form of dominance that felt almost understated, yet proved difficult to counter. For German officers observing these operations, the lesson was unsettling. Long-held assumptions about when battles began no longer applied. Dawn was no longer a signal. It was a milestone already passed. Defensive systems built around predictable rhythms struggled to adapt to an enemy that treated every hour as usable. The broader meaning extended beyond the war itself. Post-war military doctrine across multiple nations would reflect this reality. Tempo, synchronization, and reliability became central concepts. Technology would advance, but the principle endured: wars are shaped not only by what forces can do, but by when they choose to act. For the men inside the tanks, the experience was more immediate. Moving through darkness and fog required trust, in training, in leadership, and in each other. That trust allowed them to operate where uncertainty once ruled. It turned marginal hours into decisive moments. When the mist finally lifted and the battlefield became visible, the outcome was already unfolding. Not because of surprise alone, but because preparation had arrived ahead of expectation. In that quiet advantage lay the true measure of American dominance, a mastery not just of machines, but of time itself.